welcome to A Push with Lennox, and today we're talking about another colonial region, the Middle Colonies. And they're called that quite honestly because they're in the middle. I know, it's pretty self-explanatory, but sometimes you just need to explain it. Middle colonies were also known as the breadbasket colonies, and a lot of this had to do with their geography. Now we know up in New England, the soil was very rocky and they had harsh winters, and so there wasn't a lot of agricultural endeavors going on up there. Instead, they relied on the natural resources, the lumber, the fishing, the deep harbors for trade. So that's what they built their economy on. In the South, very rich, fertile soil, a long growing period. And so you would see long-term crops like tobacco and rice and later cotton that would become the economic basis for those colonies. But in the Middle Colonies, they kind of had a mix between the Southern and the New England because, they're in the middle. They had a growing season, unlike New England, but it was shorter, unlike the Southern colonies. So what they were able to grow is what we call winter crops. And these are typically grain-based crops. So like wheat and rye and barley. And so that's how they got the nickname the breadbasket, because they were growing the grains that would be used to make bread. So that's the big economic differences between, the Middle Colonies and the other two regions. But let's look at some other differences. First, let's start with the colony of Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, and he created this colony as a refuge for the Quakers. The Quakers are another religious group, and his colonization of this area is referred to as the Holy Experiment, because not only was he founding this colony on the idea of, I'm going to create a haven for the Quakers, he was going to welcome everybody in. Now, this is William Penn here, and some of you guys might know him as the Quaker Oats guy. Yeah, he does kind of look like him, and yeah, Quaker did use his image to sell their oats because oats kind of fit in the breadbasket. See how that all works together? But William Penn's going to come in, and he's going to create this colony. He's actually going to treat the Native Americans fairly, very similar to Roger Williams. He is going to purchase the land from the Native Americans. He's going to run a very liberal colony. They're going to have a representative government like we've seen before, and they're going to practice religious toleration and freedom. Much more so than what we saw, say, in Maryland. Remember, Maryland was set up as a haven for English Catholics, but they said all Christian religions were welcome there. The key word being Christian. Pennsylvania, it doesn't matter what religion you are. If you don't even have a religion, you are welcome to come in. And here's a big one. They extended rights to women. Yeah, believe it or not, William Penn and Pennsylvania, women had a lot of the same rights that men had. In fact, when we look at Pennsylvania, it was the most heterogeneous colony amongst all of them. Let me give you a little bit of a background on the Quakers. Now, a lot of people, when they hear Quakers today, they think pacifist, and they absolutely were. They are against all forms of violence and war. And if you look at the foundations of that belief, you might be able to understand it a little bit more. First of all, they believed that God is love, period. And that everyone has the light of God burning within them. They called it the inner light. And we all have it in us. And they believed that if we let our life be guided by that light, then we're going to achieve that full relationship with God. And we don't need a priest or a minister to lead us to that. We can have a direct relationship with God. On top of that, they believed if you allow that inner light to guide you, if that brings you into full relationship with God, then you will experience redemption and the idea of heaven here while you're on earth. It's not something that you have to wait for. It's something that you can have here on earth. So those are the foundational beliefs of the Quakers. Now, when we look a little bit further, we're going to see that their main values are peace, equality, and freedom of conscience. Now, we've heard that term before, freedom of conscience. I think I referred to it in my New England video, liberty of conscience. And that's what Roger Williams was going to bring to his colony of Rhode Island. And the idea of this liberty of conscience means we all have the freedom or the liberty to choose what path we're going to follow with regards to religion or no religion. And so that's going to be instituted into the Pennsylvania colony. They also believed in very strong social activism. So they're going to fight things like against slavery. They're going to fight for prison reform. They're going to fight for pacifism, but they're going to push the idea of pacifism. Now, I want you to understand, this was happening in the 1600s. This is not something that's going to happen, it doesn't start to happen until like the 1800s, leading into something like the Civil War. It's happening early. One very big group of Quakers that was famous for a lot of this were known as the Valiant 60. This was 60 Quakers, men and women, missionaries, priests, but farmers and, just average Joes who were part of the Valiant 60 who would go out, they came from England, but they went out and fought for all of these ideas. So the Quakers kind of had this view of the society of how it should be, and they started fighting for it and pushing for it early in American history. I'd like to take just a moment and break down the difference between the Quaker Church and the Anglicans, or the Church of England, because there is some very specific differences between the two. For instance, the Church of England believed in practicing the sacraments like baptism and communion, or confirmation is another one. The Quakers, or as they were also known as the Society of Friends, believed that we didn't need to practice sacraments because we all have God within us. That's that inner light, the direct connection with God. The Church of England showed their faith by reciting the Creed, the Apostles' Creed, explaining exactly what they believe in every single service. Whereas the Society of Friends, or the Quakers, said we just got to share our values, those values of peace and love and anti-war and stuff like that. Church of England would have normal church services, whereas the Society of Friends, they have meetings. Everyone just comes together. You have clergy, the ministers, and an hierarchy of leadership within the Church of England. Well, we already talked about, with the direct connection with God, the Quakers didn't believe they needed ministers or anything, so you had a priesthood of all believers, even women. Okay? So everyone had the propensity to be able to share their faith and their beliefs. Finally, the Church of England expected social conformity. You see that a lot, like with the Puritans. You need to conform to the way we do it. Whereas the Society of Friends, no, you need to focus more on society as making it better. We don't need to conform to one idea. We need to take what's wrong with society and fix it. So that's where social activism is going to come in. When we get to other colonies beyond Pennsylvania, you're going to see New York is going to come in. Now, New York played a very key geographical role for England, because what New York did was New York was originally held by the Netherlands. Its original name was New Netherland, and their capital was New Amsterdam. And they separated the southern colonies from the New England colonies. And so you have this big block of land separating these two other big blocks of land, but there's one, that one in the middle is owned by another country. So Charles II, King Charles II says, I want New York. And he's going to send a military force basically into Hudson Bay, a big naval force that's going to kind of point their guns at New York and say, hey, give it to us. And the Dutch say, hey, here you go. And so they're very easily going to be able to take New Netherland from the Dutch. James, the Duke of York, is going to be given control of this colony, and hence you have New York. They are going to not only bring all the colonial regions together, so bringing New York in brings all the colonies together. They also bring in a territory rich in fur, which is going to be very economically beneficial to New York and to England. So there you go. There's New York's primary economic foundation. And it's also going to give England control of the entire Atlantic seaboard, meaning the entire Atlantic coast England now controls in the New World. The other two colonies that make up this region are New Jersey and Delaware. Now, interestingly, both of these colonies were originally part of the land that the Duke of York got, which they took from the Dutch. But what the Duke of York did was he actually sold off those two parcels. Well, not really sold off. For instance, New Jersey, he owed a debt to Sir George Carteret, and he ends up giving him that land to pay off that debt. And Cartwright's going to name it after his homeland of Jersey back in England. So that's how we get New Jersey. Delaware, on the other hand, was purchased from the Duke of York by William Penn. And for about 30 or 40 years, Delaware is actually part of the governing body of Pennsylvania. But eventually they will get their, I guess, quote, independence, or they're going to create their own government, so they won't fall under the umbrella of Pennsylvania. But that's it. That's the 4 colonies that make up the Middle Colonies: Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, and New Jersey. Well, that's it. Hopefully, you got a little bit more knowledge about the Middle Colonies, and if not, like I always say, you can always go back and watch it again. Heck, watch it 3 times if you want. Share it with your friends. Other than that, I do appreciate you watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.